Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the panelists. We're very excited about this event, extremely excited about doing this. We'll get to it right away. Let me introduce our panelists. We have Thiago Rondon, who's the coordinator at Combating Digital Disinformation Program at the Superior Electoral Court, the TSC in Brazil. Natália Leal, who's a Chief Executive Officer at Agência Lupa, and Brunna Rosa, who is the Director of the Digital Communications Department for the Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva presidential campaign. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you again for joining us. We know it's been a busy time for you, and we know and nothing has stopped for you, and the busyness continues. With that, I think I'll first ask Thiago to talk a bit about the TSC, the role that they play, what the experience was during this presidential cycle, and any other observations he may want to make. Once Thiago finishes, in about 20 minutes, we will then have a conversation with Natália and Brunna. With that, I think I've covered all the essential bases at this point. So Thiago, please, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the TSC and what you saw during the election.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. I greet here my colleagues, my virtual colleagues, Natália and Brunna. Due to our short time, I will do a brief introduction, as I mentioned with Ken, about the permanent program to combat disinformation in the Superior Electoral Court that recently was instituted here during the elections. This is a program that was enacted in August 4th, 2021. So it's a permanent program, and it represents the continuity and the improvements of TSC to reduce the negative impacts related to electoral justice, to the members, to the voting process, the electoral process in its different phases, and everyone involved in that process. Our approach of the program is in conformity with the main recommendation and surveys about disinformation nationally and internationally. So that's why it's important for us to participate in this meeting and several others that we conduct with research organizations throughout the world. We act systemically. It's an interdisciplinary and multi-sectorial approach. The program opted for a network operation, which is based on the departments of the electoral justice and strategic partners. So in that scenario, the TSC acts as a hub for cooperation and engagement with society. Just so I can give you a brief history, the effects, these harmful effects that have become even more evident in the recent trends with the disinformation campaigns, not only against public people and politicians, but also the integrity of the electoral process. That is a fact that we have been observing in several countries. We have been seeing an increasing attacks against collaborators of the electoral system and the electoral system itself, with allegations of fraud and attempts to delegitimize the electoral process and its results. And that doesn't only happen in Brazil. We have noticed that phenomenon in the United States in the 2016 elections. Here in Brazil in 2018, especially when there is a massive campaign against the electoral process. Historically, we had never seen something so big in 2020. We have also noticed that in Colombia in 2018 in the Peru presidential elections and in Mexico as well. The European Commission his screen froze.
Yeah, let's see if we can get him back. Maybe while we wait for Thiago, Moderator, can we see if we can get a hold of Thiago to let him know that he froze? Maybe we could move on to Natália. Natália, are you there? While we wait for Thiago to come back, Natália, maybe you could begin talking a bit about what you saw within the misinformation throughout the campaign across all parties and the like. And then as soon as Thiago comes back, we'll go back to him. Natália, could you pick it up, please?
Yes, good morning. I think
Sorry.
Thiago is back, so I don't think I need to.
Okay. Thanks for stepping in anyway, Natália. Thiago, you have it. The floor is yours again. Thank you.
I'm sorry, my internet, I got disconnected and I changed to my mobile connection. Can you hear me?
Hear you fine.
Yes. So I was saying that you were hearing a bit about the history, and for example, the European Commission conducted a study that revealed that 11 electoral processes in the world were contaminated by heavy disinformation in the last few years. So since then, the courts have been coming up with strategies to combat disinformation, especially the ones who seek to delegitimize the electoral process that has been used constantly. And it's been used constantly, not just during the electoral period, but outside of that as well. So a few specific points. The program is based upon interdisciplinary approaches. We have more than 150 partners. The objective is to preserve people's rights to exert their rights to vote, to ensure clean elections and preserve democracy. One of the main focus in 2022 was to fight inauthentic behaviors and violent speech. Just to give you an idea about the size of Brazil in the digital environment, Brazil has about 2,015 million inhabitants, and we have 230 million cell phones. We have more cell phones than people at the moment. And that makes it so that we have a few numbers, for example, such as 80% of the population use social media actively every day. And currently, we have agreements with the main platforms used by Brazilians of social media: Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, Google, Twitter, TikTok, Kawaii, Telegram, Spotify, LinkedIn, and Twitch. It's also important to highlight and thank for the efforts of a few actors who are specialists in acting in that field, which are the checkers, the fact checkers. We have, for example, in Brazil, we have as partners Agência Lupa, Verifica, eFarsas, Comprova, Wall Fact, and Fact or Fake. And in the last 2 years, we have worked with specialists in cybersecurity, with OSINT tools, so we can have more comprehensive operations on the networks, which have proven to be of significant relevance in the 2022 elections. All our programs, I have here a printed version, but I will send Ken an address where it's completely detailed, and there are versions in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. We also have reports of the results that are all available in our website. So how does the program work with this network of 150 partners? It's divided into 3 axes. The first axis is to spread quality information about the electoral process. So we seek out several initiatives to conduct that. For example, be it organizations of civil society as well as the great platforms. There's another axis which is of training. This training axis acts internally in the electoral justice, just so you can get an idea how big that is. The electoral justice in Brazil has over 22,000 collaborators. So we seek to train all these collaborators about disinformation, about the tactics that are used for disinformation. And we also count on more than 5,000 ballot helpers who are also trained on how to combat disinformation. And the third axis is to how to identify the negative effects of disinformation in general. So to try to give you an idea of the dimension of that effect in 2022, and I think this is one of the great initiatives of the courts, is that if in 2018, the platforms did not have any sort of formal cooperation with the courts, in 2022, they set up formal agreements with the superior electoral court, and they described specific actions that they would conduct to inform and to train and how to combat that. And I want to cite 3 important points in social media. First was that platforms set up conduct for candidates in Portuguese, and they described what were the rules for each of these platforms about this information regarding the electoral process. The second one was the creation of an extrajudicial channel. And what does that mean? They set up a channel for a quick response to the courts with teams dedicated for Brazil. We would send platforms an alert telling them what was going on so that they could take measures based on their own policies. And the third point was to innovate in the products so that quality information, for example, could reach the electorate, the voters. I would just like to highlight very briefly WhatsApp, for example. We created a communication channel that today is the world's largest chatbot in WhatsApp from the Superior Electoral Court. And we have the most notifications as well. We have millions of Brazilians getting direct WhatsApp notifications. We have agreements with Facebook, Meta, Twitter, YouTube, where we sought to innovate within the products. For example, in YouTube, there were several conspiracy theories about the lack of auditing with the electoral justice. So we were able to label specific videos and share how the auditing is conducted. And we have more than 500,000, about 500,000 to 1 million accesses per week to that specific label. And with Meta, we had updates, shared about how to update your electoral title. And we had an ad that had more than 500,000 views. The important message here is that when we are able to share information about the electoral process and have initiatives with great technology partners, we noticed that the disinformation about that process tends to decrease. So acting together with that is very interesting. We had an innovating agreement with Telegram this year, where we were able to set up an official Telegram channel where we observed sharing messages about the electoral process within Telegram, which was a process that we could not see inside, and we did not see any quality content shared about the electoral process in general. So a few brief things that I would like to share is that from 2022 on, we had a few big concerns about the platforms. First was the lack of structure in Brazil in terms of personnel and technologies to deal in Portuguese. The second was the conduct policy. We saw that in 2018, the conduct policies cited examples of elections in the United States and not the Brazilian procedure within our context. Their data lacking in general for researchers. There's also transparency in how content is moderated, innovation in the product. There's a big concern that we have that we noticed in 2022 was multi-platform disinformation. So professional actors try to seek loopholes to share little bits of content in several platforms, so they don't completely violate the policies of a certain platform. It's very borderline on their policies of a specific platform. And we noticed that this information and things that incited violent conduct was truly a challenge that we faced this year, of being in a very narrow line. For example, the debate about military intervention in Brazil. That was a debate that for some platforms in the beginning of the campaign it seemed to be freedom of speech. But then with the electoral process, it seems that some platforms began altering their own policies to state that this is a reason to incite violence. They altered their own policies in that sense. So working with the specific policies of the platforms during the electoral process was very important. Another example that might be worth sharing is that in Brazil, we get the elections results in a matter of hours. When people stop voting at 5 p.m., before midnight, the results have already been declared. And we did a specific work with the platform so that they could update their policies on Sunday night, because the allegations of fraud should contemplate a result, for example, an official result from the court. So we conducted training with the policy teams of the big platforms to describe how the results were shared in Brazil. And that was very important to check the allegations of fraud against the electoral process. And lastly, I know that we're a little bit over the time, but I think with the construction of an alert system where we offered a system so that any voter could report to the courts any disinformation about integrity of the elections. We built a team within the court that would analyze these reports and would forward it quickly to the platforms. In critical moments and during the election, we sought to act on critical events within an hour and a half. We sought to act quickly during the elections in about 15 to 30 minutes in cases that are more severe, especially in regards to inciting violence, which was one of our great concerns during the elections. But that's it. I know our time is short, so I don't want to take up any more space. And I will share a link here about information and what we did this year, and reports that will be released here in the beginning of the year about combat actions to combat disinformation in TSC.
Thank you so much, Thiago. I know we're running a little over, but I'm going to abuse my privilege a bit. I want to ask you just a few questions, and will not be the last that we do an event on this issue, as you know. One is, did you have any visibility about the origin of the disinformation? In other words, was it mostly generated inside of Brazil? Was it generated from countries outside of Brazil? Do you have any visibility on that? Sorry, I didn't get the interpretation on that.
He spoke in. Ken asked if you have an idea about the source of this information, if most of it came from players from Brazil or from abroad. Are there other countries involved in disinformation in Brazil? Well, this is a very complex question. I have three topics to talk. First one is the foreign intervention, which we talk about a lot. And when we look in the academy about this, we look at the interference between nations, something that we see in Europe, and that maybe it's not our greatest challenge right now, but we see the use of foreign infrastructure and players that are from outside Brazil to try to find breaches in the electoral system in Brazil. So we see people coming from Brazil to abroad to try to manipulate the process in Brazil. And I think one of the greatest challenges we are going to have in the future is funding. Looking at the funding of this disinformation infrastructures that often that we must think about how it's funded. So there are many infrastructures of dissemination, such as bulk messaging, but also advertising. We have seen this year some ads made outside of Brazil, trying to attack Brazil from outside, trying to attack the electoral system with disinformation. I think it's like this.
Thank you, Thiago. I'm going to squeeze one more question. Well, maybe it's 1.5. First of all, do you continue monitoring disinformation until the inauguration on January 1st, or are you not allowed to continue to do that? Or do you continue to monitor it every day of the year, 365 days a year?
The program is permanent. It's not temporary, so it's happening regardless of being in elections or not. And another thing is that besides the monitoring, we look for specialized partners. So we have some experts and types of disinformation and types of platforms. So we have some partners who have specialized in WhatsApp, others in Quai, others in inauthentic behavior, in actions with digital influencers. So during the elections, we have learned that instead of promoting and our own tool, we have a network of actors, of players that help this in Brazil. I think this is very important. We have to foster Brazilian players. And I think that in Brazil and in other countries in the world to do this. So one challenge is the funding of these players and having transparency from these platforms, data transparency. And I think this is going to be a very important topic next year, possibly appearing in debates about the regulations of social media in Brazil.
Thank you very much, Thiago. I'm sure we all have a lot more questions, but we promised that we would let you go back to work. So thank you very much for your time. And we will be reconvening with you again shortly. Thank you very much. I'd like to call on.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Natália, if I may call on you now, you one of the keenest observers and monitors of what's going on in disinformation in Brazil. What are your overall views about disinformation during this campaign, where it was coming from? Was it coming more on one side or the other side? Your overall summary of what you saw, and then we'll go to Brunna to talk about how she handled this from the Lula campaign. But maybe Natália, you could start us off. Thank you.
You're listening to me, right? Okay, so good morning to everyone. Thank you for the space to do this. And what we have seen generally is that disinformation is a very central thing in these elections. Since 2018, we have expected this. There are some studies that show disinformation influenced many elections around the world since 2016, when started talking about this topic and this started to be discussed around the world. So we had in Brazil in 2022 disinformation as the central point of all campaigns, all political campaigns. They all were involved in fighting disinformation, but also made use of this disinformation as a strategy, which is not something new to us, because we know about political campaigns and that political marketing uses disinformation strategically. So the cooperation, as Thiago said, well, Lupa is one of the fact-checking platforms, which is part of the permanent committee of the Supreme Electoral Court of Brazil. And we see cooperation as a key feature to have some effect against disinformation, but we haven't overcome this yet, because I think the more we talk about disinformation, the bigger it becomes. It has many different layers to it. Sometime before we thought it was a problem of journalism. Nowadays, we see it as a problem of society. So we have changed this paradigm about the consumption of information. So people are not looking to journalism as a source of information that much as we did before. There's a crisis in how people trust institutions and how information is being consumed through social media and produced in social media. So when we like some kind of content, when we make a comment online, we are also producing information, and we are being part of this big cycle of disinformation that has been created and developed over the last years. In 2022, we have seen much disinformation about the electoral process. This was one of our biggest concerns, and there were problems with the how trustworthy were the election polls, the voting machines, and the results of the elections. And this was mostly coming from the far right of the government. So there is some disinformation is used by everyone. In the runoff elections, we had also the left wing using this disinformation, especially with André Janones, who was the candidate, and then started supporting Lula, the elected president. So we had this in the second round, but we can say that the attacks to the voting machines were coming mostly from the administration, the government of President Bolsonaro was also a candidate, and far right, coming from outside of Brazil and inside, because we have many supporters of the far right that are living with after they're living outside Brazil, and they are using this to spread disinformation and not being held liable in the Brazilian territory. In the second round of the elections, we have candidates being attacked with disinformation, with reputation issues, like accusing someone of being something, but also big topics of politics were also being used, like communism, military intervention, and this was being used to create some kind of moral panic in people, very connected to customs, to the moral. So things like the the gay kit used supposedly used in schools, the way schools have carried out the politics about sexual education. We had a lot of these issues in the second round. And also we had attacks to the voting machines and the elections with disinformation. And in the second round, we had a ruling from the Electoral Court that was faster to take this disinformation from the media and to remove all of these questions that were happening about the results of the elections. So we have worked with this, I myself and other people who are working with fact checking, that we prepared to take some kind of attitude to demand platforms to remove some contents online.
In a general vision, what we saw the most is what we saw the most during this election. As Thiago also mentioned, as we saw, is that this information about the Brazilian electoral process is generated mostly inside Brazil. There are actors who produce information content inside Brazil. But that doesn't mean that they haven't learned with what has happened abroad. So the Brazilian far right is very connected with the practices of the Republican Party in the United States. Steve Bannon acted as a consultant to Jair Bolsonaro's campaign, and a lot of the practices that were adopted by Trump after the results in 2020, they also echoed here in Brazil in 2022. So there is a moment between the result and taking office, which is very delicate. And we have seen several protests which were influenced by the most part by disinformation, things that could even be funny if they weren't so sad, and showed to be a symptom of the moment that we're living in. How many people are just simply influenced by disinformation? I have a few concerns, that we can discuss throughout our conversation on how we will act from now on. But in conclusion, that is it, and I'm available to talk more about the subject.
Thank you, Natália. Yeah, it seems to be one of the exports from the US these days, certainly from the Republican Party. We'll come to that. Brunna, thank you so much for being patient and waiting for us to come around to you. I think it's a good time now for you to talk about how you dealt with all of this. As Natália said, not only did you have the issues of the campaign, misinformation coming at you, you had misinformation about the integrity of the electoral process coming at you, and now you are still dealing with it a little bit, as Natália had just spoken about post-election. So perhaps Brunna, you could help us, and I know Brunna has some slides, so maybe if we could bring up those slides now. Marta, do you have those? There we go. Okay, Brunna.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Marta. Good morning, everyone. I thank you. I thank you for the invitation and participation. And I am sure that the problem of fake news and disinformation is a social and global problem. So I'll bring my experiences with these initiatives, which is the first step combating that, because being successful in it is a little bit more complicated. But I would just like to present a little bit of our journey with the campaign that I just finished. And I'm speaking from our campaign headquarters. Martha, please, the next slide. Thank you. And next. Well, I will begin in introducing myself. I'm in Brunna Rosa, the digital communication director of Lula's campaign. The campaign had several initiatives, but I'll talk about Verdade na Rede, which is truth in the networks, which combats fake news. Verdade na Rede came about in 2020 inside the PT party, and it came as a result of the 2018 elections that was very violent and aimed at fake and had a lot of fake news. And it was something that the institutions weren't really expecting. A lot of people were caught by surprise. So we developed this project to combat disinformation. And we applied it during the municipal campaigns of 2020. And the cities that applied the method that we developed were the cities that had the most success in combating fake news in the 2020 elections. So based on that, and also in other previous experiences of other campaigns, I coordinated Dilma's campaign in 2010 and 2014. So we brought the Verdade na Rede project in 2022 as an important tool in our digital strategy for combating disinformation. I will present a little bit of the axis that we structured on to be able to combat disinformation. So the first point is that we focused on engagement and mobilization, and we transformed reporting fake news into a civic duty, a civic act. So we created a website where people could report fake news. There was a full registration, and we had a fact-checking team behind it, and we encouraged people to report fake news. So if you got fake news in your cell phone, don't share it to anyone else, but instead report it to our system, and we'll act on it. And we'll act on it in terms of media, of politics, and legal. So we had some success in that. So we worked with engagement and mobilization. We also worked with political articulation with the civil society. We involved other actors of society in that discussion, in that we presented that as a problem of society, and to combat it, we need society to be with us. We dialogued with TSC, and we were with TSC during the whole process that they had and preparing, which was extremely important to guarantee a democratic election in the country. We also worked with digital forensics. We collected links, and we analyzed the links and analyzed the data, and we forwarded to the legal team, and they opened suits and reported to the authorities. Another path that we invested highly on when the Verdade na Rede project is sort of digital literacy. We didn't want to blame the normal people who would spread fake news. We wanted to get to the big producers of disinformation and fake news. We wanted to aim at the people who think and structure the dissemination and spreading, and not some family member who receives this information as a confirmation bias and is enraged and shares that information with someone else. So we invested in the process of digital literacy and try to explain to the militant base of the Workers' Party, and then to a larger segment of civil society, on how to identify fake news, how to combat that, and how to become a part of this process of guaranteeing that the person might have a choice, like to choose quality information and then decide what to do, and not just be the receiver or of manipulated message and then pass it on along. And lastly, we invested in deconstruction of and exposing. We did sort of vaccines on how we received reports and how we monitored process, and we exposed the main liars. Where would we expose them? In our website, in Lula's social networks and websites, and we exposed these big liars. That process. A little bit about the numbers, and then I'll conclude my presentation. We received 22,429 reports, qualified reports, with names and documents, with attachments of the reports, which we examined and put it within a process of legal evaluation. We were in dialogue with fact-checking agencies, and they also have their own procedures to fact-check. The fact-checking agencies would sometimes reach out to us to try to figure out if something was true or not. So we took advantage of that, and we put that in our website to have a sort of a vaccine bank, so people could log into our website and research a term, for example, more taxes, and this vaccine bank would give you results of all the results of the fact-checking agencies. It would just list the results with topics on that keyword. We produced a lot of content so that the digital universe could be better comprehended, and we also invested in engagement. We got almost 18,000 volunteers, for people who registered and tried to collaborate with us, and we would give them tasks to execute. And we have had a relevant number of people in WhatsApp where they daily receive proper information, and they can report the fake news and make the reports in this digital space. And lastly, our efforts got a lot of strength when we started acting with the legal department, the legal team. We were able to remove pieces. We made requests to TSC with we tried to forward it in enough time so that the Supreme Court could analyze that, and we had 79 legal victories, and we have hundreds of fake news removed, taken down. So that's a little bit of how we combated disinformation during the elected and how we acted. So thank you for the space for letting us present our work. Thank you very much.
Brunna, thank you very much. I want to ask a question or two, and then obviously bring Natália back in to respond. You know, obviously you emphasized the legal route that you took to combat, but a lot of this fake news happens very, very quickly, and judicial process isn't so quick, or it can be quicker in this case. What did you do, as we say, in real time or immediately to try and counteract? I know you said you put things on your website, but did you immediately have put out the truth on something or your version of it on WhatsApp messages and across the various platforms? How did you coordinate that?
Okay, so it's a bit more complex. Not everything people produce about Lula, for instance, that are lies, we respond immediately. So the first point is that we must monitor all the time so we know what's happening. So we can make also a strategic interpretation of what is happening, who is producing, why are they producing this news. So the far right, they usually work with disinformation in a very strategic manner. It's not something new to politics to use fake news as a weapon, but with the technological advancements, it became more complex, faster. So firstly, we have to monitor and know what's happening. Secondly, we should assess whether we can and make a statement about this officially, an official statement. We know that when we answer a piece of fake news, we don't have the same, we cannot reach as much as the fake news, a piece of fake news reaches. But we do this sometimes just to not to make it stronger or bigger. So for instance, is Lula sick right now? This is a piece of fake news that's happening now. In the context in which Lula is the Brazilian president, we shouldn't worry about giving a quick response, but we use data, then analyze it politically to see if it's worth answering it, giving a responsive statement. If we do so, we use Google, WhatsApp, search engines to be always on top of the results. And in search engines, for instance, we have also in the elections worked with paid advertisement. Brunna is muted now.
But Brunna, I think you're muted now. No?
She asked if we are listening to her.
Yeah, we can hear you, Brunna. I think you just were muted for 1 second, but we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I answered you, but it's something like that. You have to assess it politically so as not to make the fake news larger, the piece of news stronger. So we use all the tools we have to do it in the
Right.
digital universe.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to ask you this question, but I'll bring Natália back in on this. It sounds to me that there's a lot of faith. There's a lot of faith put in. It sounds to me like there's a fair amount of faith that you feel that the Lula campaign certainly felt, maybe generally, on the ability of the TSC, the honest attempt, the good attempts, and the effectiveness to a degree of TSC to control this, not completely, but that it's a good thing that it exists, and it's a good thing that it does act as a bit of a check on some of the fake news. Is that your impression as well, Natália? In other words, it's a whole lot better that TSE exists and does the work they do than, like in many countries, where there's no equivalent to TSE.
I believe so. From 2018 to 2022, we had a lot of developments in fighting fake news. Many new players have come, but we should be very careful about what is fighting disinformation from the journalism perspective, and the journalism and its role in to qualify the public debate, to improve the public debate, and fighting disinformation as a strategy of politics, and can also be interpreted as some kind of manipulation. There are many TSC, the Superior Electoral Court, and political campaign have very different objectives. So they, in a campaign, they want to promote their image, their reputation, and fact-checking, for instance, fact-checking agencies work in different things. We work with high standards of transparency in regards to our methodology, the sources of information used to do the fact-checking, transparency in regard to the source of the funding of the journalists that work at Lupa. We at Lupa work with, we are not taking, we are non-partisans. We do not make fake symmetries. We know disinformation comes much more from a field of the politics than the other, but we check all of them, and we don't use fact-checking to promote a narrative or hide another narrative. And we also try to correct our mistakes very fast. We always admit to our mistakes and we correct them, we make them right. So these are the standards used in journalism. Lupa does not only does journalism, but also works with media, with different products. But in the elections, we work mostly with journalism using these standards. So this is one of my biggest concerns now, from now on, how to fight disinformation that comes also from institutions. For instance, in the case of the Superior Electoral Court, although we have a very strong network of mutual support, that is fact checkers, they help the Electoral Court, and the Electoral Court helps us. Sometimes we don't have their answers as quickly as we want. Sometimes they don't give us all the information we want to conduct the fact checking. So we sometimes think that the fact checking is used as a tool to strengthen the reputation of the Electoral Court. also. So we must separate these things. But I believe at this time, disinformation is so present that I believe all initiatives to fight disinformation have to be used. And if we don't have initiatives such as these during the campaigns, by the electoral court or by the campaigns, I believe we would have much bigger a problem than we have today. But we also must look at initiatives. We must be careful that some initiatives can be used to promote some brands, the reputations of someone, and this must not be used as journalism.
Thank you, Natália. That brings me back to Brunna then. Brunna, what have you learned? What are the major things that you have learned in this campaign and the ongoing campaign, as it happens to be? And are there any preliminary recommendations that you would make for how the system to fight disinformation can be strengthened? Brunna, did you hear the question? Yeah, okay.
I think my colleague, my virtual colleague, mentioned about the importance of having initiatives to debate that, because we're in a moment where the problem of disinformation and fake news in society is gigantic and is part of our day-to-day lives. So we need to take advantage of this moment to educate people so they can consume information in a way that's safer, so to speak. We had a pandemic, COVID, and with COVID, we also faced a very big disinformation campaign related to vaccines and the virus. So it seems that disinformation is a problem in the same size of, for example, global warming, and we have been learning during the last few elections, then we need to act in partnership with networks so we are able to fight that. Thiago mentioned about the TSC, and we also do this here to have a hub of researchers and a hub for monitoring this, so we can better see internet as a broader territory, and to foster several groups that are in these different virtual territories. Sometimes what happens in Facebook has nothing to do with what happens on TikTok. So being present in these virtual territories and working with the researchers and working with people who are studying that, it's a constant learning process. And another learning process is how to maintain this mobilization and engagement of people. We have learned that a lot of people became engaged with our activities, publishing manifesto with the big tech companies, having a more effective policy to combat fake news, or to have people as volunteers to be fact checkers against fake news. So it seems society has become more mobilized, and they have more desire to receive information on what to do so that they can have a healthier access to information. So these are the learnings that I share with you.
Thank you, Brunna. The one last question for you and Natália is, are there other models or other countries in the world that have models that you look to that you think would be useful for Brazil to adapt or to use in their system? It could be countries, groups of countries, the European Union, or are you aware of others that you think are more effective than perhaps the system you have in Brazil now?
I don't see today any country that has an effective policy, an effective institutional policy for combating disinformation. In my personal professional opinion, I consider that it's important to have a discussion on the about the platforms, with the platforms that are agents that propagate this information. There are environments where disinformation is easily spread, but also I don't think it's possible for us to have legislation on disinformation. What we need to have is legislation on the responsibility of the platforms in that process. I think that the experience of the European Union, and we need to stay close to that and monitor that. But we know that in Asia, there are countries that enacted legislation against disinformation, and it was a failure. And it's very hard to combat disinformation through the legal venues. The best experience that we know are the experience of Nordic countries that involve education. There is a training process to combat disinformation ever since kids go to school, or sometimes even before they go to school, or with information to the parents. But we know that that reality is very distant from Brazilian reality, and we need to advance the public policies so that we can have a media literacy program that is effective in schools. Lupa has a partnership with some teaching networks, education networks, but we know that it's still too far away to reach the status of countries such as Norway. So there are several examples, but I just don't see Brazil fitting into that relation in that reality from medium to long to short term. This movement is hard to comprehend, and we're all in the eye of the storm. So we'll be able to analyze that in a few years so we can have a better idea of what this phenomenon actually is. So we're building some. At the same time, when the problem is emerging, so we don't have a final answer. We need to build that answer together.
Thank you. Thank you, Natália. Brunna, I'll give you the privilege of the last word. As I understand, Thiago, the mandate of TSE and his mandate is 365 days a year, every year. As you go forward, and you're dealing with issues right now, as has come up, will you continue to look to the TSE and the disinformation branch to file claims or to use when you think that there's rhetoric that's disinformation? Or do you see that as once January 1st happens, you really won't be interacting with the TSE in any way?
Well, TSE is an acronym for the Superior Electoral Court, and they enforce laws about the electoral process. And in the legal aspect, combating information gains more speed during the election, because the processes, they travel at a different pace, because as Natália said, it's extremely hard to combat fake news based on legislation, because there are different timelines. When you you make a political legal piece, and then you forward it, you open a suit process. It takes a long time just so that you have an idea. TSC opened their session this year, judging fake news from last year's regarding the gay kits. So it's 4 years, just so you can have an idea. So that process gains more speed, specifically with the election. And we had more advancements, but after the electoral process, the elections are over. It's no longer the TSC's responsibility to continue that. I'm sure that they will continue their work articulating and coordinating with the platforms, because the platforms need to be penalized as well, because the platforms, they profit from fake news. And one truth is that lies make money, and we need to penalize the people who profit from this. So that's also the role of TSC, and the coordination that they've been doing with other partners. But our case gains new grounds in combating disinformation. If that will result in a special department in Lula's government, and I'm not sure, because that's still in discussion, but we start coordinating more with other institutions other than just the electoral ones.
Thank you, Brunna. I've abused everybody's time. It's been over an hour. So I have to unfortunately close this very interesting conversation. We will revisit it. I thank you, Thiago, Natália, and Brunna. As we said, I just said we will revisit it. We will post a video of this event in English and in Portuguese on our website tonight, or no later than tomorrow. And we hope you feel free to distribute it to whomever you want, across the good platforms, of course, the truth-seeking platforms. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks to everybody who joined us, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.